Okay, good morning. Welcome to the NIPF International Conference on Papers in Public Finance, first session. I'm very glad to welcome all of you. This is an online session this year due to these circumstances, and I'm very glad that you have all joined early in the morning in Delhi on time. So it's great to have you. We have 4 papers in this first session. The session is on fiscal policy, debt deficits, and economic activity. The first paper is going to be presented by Anshuman. Anshuman, you are here and your slideshow is up. Yes. Okay. And the second will be presented by Piali, who has also joined. The third by Sonalika. Sonalika, you are here. Okay. I see you on video, but I suppose you're here.
Yes, I'm here.
Sonalika, hi.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you now. And the fourth paper is going to be presented by Binod Kumar Behra. Hi, Binod, are you here? No. Okay, since that's the fourth paper and we are already at 9:03, let's start now. The rules will be, so we have 100 minutes and 4 papers, so 25 minutes each. I think 15 minutes for the presenters to present their papers, 5 minutes for the discussants, and then we'll hopefully have 5 minutes left for questions and answers. So let's just go straight into the first paper, which is on fiscal dominance in India by Anshuman. Over to you, Anshuman.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik. Good morning to participants from India and greetings to all delegates joining from time zones other than the Indian. I deem it a unique honor to present my paper at this gathering of exalted minds. And I thank all the organizers of the conference, in particular Professor Chakraborty for this rare opportunity. My topic for the day is fiscal dominance in India. At the outset, let me disclaim that the views I present here are my personal and purely personal and do not reflect the official position of the organizations that I'm associated with. So fiscal dominance has been usually referred to mean the fiscal authority's profligacy being accommodated by the monetary authority. Now, the monetary authority fine-tunes the supply of money in line with the chosen expenditure of the fiscal authority, and that is when we say that fiscal dominance actually is in play. However, this is a rather narrow way of looking at something which is much vast in its scope. So, for example, when there's too high government debt, which renders monetary policy ineffective, or when the monetary policy aims at keeping the government sector solvent and thereby compromises on its own core priorities, that is also called fiscal dominance. So I should like to say that it's a broader term that takes within its remit a broad sway of macroeconomic occurrences, and that is what we call generically fiscal dominance. So given this broad remit that we can cover, the question that we will cover today is, does fiscal activism cause more harm than good? And this is what we try to answer in the Indian context. So to point out to this anecdote by Milton Friedman, who said that there are limitations in our ability to predict both the behavior of the system in absence of the action and effect of the action. Taking into stride all our limitations, we will still try to find an answer to the question, does fiscal activism in India cause more harm than good? Some general remarks on fiscal dominance are in order. So generally, fiscal policy determines the existence and magnitude of a deficit, whereas the monetary policy is tasked with maintaining price stability. So as we understand it, the monetary policy is required to be maintaining conditions that are conducive for long-term growth, whereas fiscal policy is required to attenuate the kind of demand that is required to tide over minor blips in the economic activity. However, monetary policy may often become a handmaiden of fiscal policy, and the resultant poor coordination may lead to pernicious impact. In the global context, Riviera and Coates in 2004 pointed out 3 ways in which these pernicious impacts might take shape. First is lower growth, higher inflation, or lesser investment. In the Indian context, in particular, Acharya 2020 talked of the various ways in which fiscal dominance in India has taken shape. And he's of the opinion that fiscal dominance in India, compared to fiscal dominance elsewhere, has much wider manifestation. So he says that fiscal dominance has hampered the pace towards achieving financial stability through adoption of macroprudential regulatory norms. It restricts timely disclosure of defaults by banks, and also it calls for transfer of excess reserves to the government from RBI instead of making RBI balance sheet more robust. So given this backdrop, let us now refer to some of the theories of fiscal dominance. Of course, these are very mathematically dense, and it wouldn't be prudent to spend a lot of time on this. So I'll just refer to them, I'll skim through them, so just to get a flavor of what they all say. So first of all, I think one of the most celebrated papers in fiscal dominance is the one by Sargent and Wallace, 1981, which is usually referred to as the unpleasant monetarist arithmetic. It propounds that when the fiscal authority determines its expenditures to be beyond its revenues without regard to the stance of the monetary authority, it leads to runaway inflation. Partly contradicting this stand is the one by Ryan, which is often known as the Reinhardt conjecture. It says that even when monetary authority plays to the fiscal gallery, its actions must respect some canons of macroeconomic management. And it essentially says that even though the fiscal authority is accommodated by the monetary authority, there is a limit on the rate of rise in inflation that the monetary authority must honor. The third is the fiscal theory of price level, and this genre of models posit that the government debt and fiscal policy are the ones that determine the price level, and monetary policy has a passive or an indirect role to play in the process. However, apart from all these theories of fiscal dominance, there are, of course, potential positives of monetary accommodation. So to be fair, we need to cover them. So Blanchard in 2019 says when interest rates are depressed below the growth rate, higher debt does not inexorably lead to higher taxes in future, and therefore monetary accommodation helps to avoid the fiscal costs associated with high debt. Similarly, other authors such as Bui et al., Rajan, and Chakraborty have said that monetary accommodation of fiscal intervention in the global financial crisis period helped alleviate economic stress without spillovers on inflation or erosion of fiscal credibility. Now, given that we have talked about the general manifestation of fiscal dominance and also the theories of the way in which fiscal dominance takes place, it is now timely to discuss various alternative empirical strategies in which fiscal dominance occurrence has been investigated in real life. So there are various ways to investigate fiscal dominance. Let me just discuss 4 of them here. So one is finding a co-integrating relationship between the nominal value of consumption, the outstanding central government debt, and the money stock, with the co-integrating factor on the outstanding government debt giving a rough estimate of the degree of fiscal dominance. Other authors have modified the policy reaction function of the monetary authority and included sovereign debt related measures in addition to the usual variables to find out what is the impact of the fiscal position on monetary response functions. Some have also found out, have also pursued panel co-integration between the series of public budget balance and series of variation in the monetary base to see if it's the government debt, government deficit that drives money creation. And finally, there's this fourth approach, which talks of rise in lagged level of debt would result in greater primary surplus in the present, or larger primary surplus in the present would reflect in a reduction in future level of debt. So these are the various alternative empirical strategies that have been pursued in the in existing literature on fiscal dominance. Having covered that, let us now look at what are the findings that people have made for developing economies. So anecdotal evidence was offered by Edwards regarding fiscal dominance in populist governance regimes such as Argentina, Peru, and Venezuela. Similarly, Lee et al. Talked of money creation being dictated by fiscal reasons in China, which so Lee et al. Essentially concludes that it's a de facto regime of fiscal dominance amidst a de jure safeguard against it in China. Similarly, Grubin and Welch investigated Latin American countries from 1995 Q1 to 2004 Q1, and he applied Granger causality and VEC models to find out how to find out various ways in fiscal dominance manifesting in these economies. Tanner and Ramos conducted this analysis for Brazil in 1991 to 2000, and where they say that the primary deficit responds to change in liabilities. And similarly, Trenovsky and Tashevska conducted a similar analysis for Macedonia for 2000-2011, and the methodology was the same. So having given this backdrop, let me now move to my preferred empirical strategy for the purpose of my paper. So the methodology I adopted was the one followed by Gruben and Welch. So its basic arguments are premised on obtaining a Granger causality in coupled relationships that involve real interest rate, growth rate of real GDP, and fiscal balance. Essentially, we find a co-integrating relationship between these variables in the context. So Gruben and Welch had conducted this in the context of Latin American countries through a VEC model, and they followed it up with the Cholesky impulse response function. The key finding of their paper is that when we find a positive association between fiscal balance and growth rate of real GDP, signifying thereby that when there's an improvement in fiscal deficit, it is directly leading to rising consumption, and therefore it's a case of perverse Keynesian fiscal policy. This is confirmatory evidence of fiscal dominance. We'll be pursuing something very similar for the case of India. So I rely on annual data for India because, as we know, quarterly data is not available. So the period I choose is from 1978 to 2019, and it covers the policy regime of automatic monetization of the deficit, which happened till 1997, of course, and the subsequent reforms whereupon no such monetization was resorted to, with FRBM Act of 2003 actually institutionalizing this prohibition. So let us briefly look at what are the variables that have been considered. So I consider three variables: BAL, real I rate, and growth. So BAL refers to gross primary fiscal deficit of the central government taken as a share of the GDP, and so real interest rate is taken as the lending interest rate adjusted for inflation as measured by the GDP deflator, and the annual growth rate is taken for the GDP at market prices based on constant local currency. Now there's a mix of sources that I've adopted for this. So the BAL variable comes from RBI, and the other variables come from the IMF. So let us now look at the results. So Granger causality, of course, as we know, gives a rough and ready idea about what we should expect in future, but of course will not be deriving very firm conclusions from this. However, let us just look at what the Granger causality says. So fiscal dominance would require that the Granger causality runs from balance to real interest rate and not real interest rate to balance. And this has been seen for Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Uruguay in Gruben and Welch, and for India in 2004 to 19 for our context. Fiscally dominated Brazil, Uruguay, and Venezuela showed that Granger causality runs from fiscal balance to growth, whereas India doesn't show this. And when we talk of Granger causality running from growth to fiscal balance, Brazil, Chile, and India in 2004 to 19 show this result. Whereas some countries show a real interest rate to growth and others show growth to real interest rate, India does not show any of these results in any of the periods considered. So to conclude, Granger causality tests that did give a flavor or some kind of indication about fiscal dominance actually happening in countries of the Latin America in the Gruben and Welch case, it did not actually give very firm results for the case of India. And therefore, we move on to fitting the VEC models. So as we know that VEC models are better over the Granger causality methods for a variety of reasons. So which some of them I have listed here. So in order to pursue the vector error correction model path, I applied the Johansson test for the co-integration, and it revealed that there exists one co-integration between the variables that we have considered. And accordingly, we take impulse response for 5 years on the basis of a 2-lag VEC model. Notice here that we are taking the model that has been followed by Gruben and Welch, and just for the sake of comparison, they consider 12 quarters for taking the impulse response. On the other hand, I'm taking for 5 years. So the results that that, excuse me, yeah. So the results that we find are as follows. So when there's a positive impulse to fiscal balance, it leads to a positive response in real interest rate. And this was entirely expected, and this does not in any way signal fiscal dominance. Similarly, we find that a positive impulse to real interest rate leads to a negative response in growth. Again, this can happen in both fiscal and monetary dominance, and therefore there's no firm result on this count. However, what we found, and this was somewhat alarming, that when we have a positive impulse to balance, there's a strong positive response to growth, which points to fiscal dominance for 1978 to 2019. And this is exactly what we had spoken about in the beginning, that Grubin and Welch found that wherever there's a improvement in fiscal deficit leading to a rise in real growth rate, this is the worrying part, because it signals hypercrowding out, and it signals that we have fiscal policy has been more damaging than giving favorable results for the economy. However, to resolve this seeming puzzle, I split my analysis into two periods. That's the 1978 to 2003 and 2004 to 2019, essentially breaking the period into two parts. And the point of breaking is when the FRBM Act was legislated. So what I found after that was the improvement in fiscal deficit raised growth rate in the first period, that's 1978 to 2003. However, it did not do so in 2004 to 2019. Therefore, we conclude that post the FRBM Act, there has been no hypercrowding out associated with fiscal deficit in the context of India. So in closing, I would like to refer to Acharya 2020, when he referred to government borrowing being in the range of 67 to 85% of GDP, which impacts future profitability of corporate investment and crowding out of resources for the corporate sector. However, our findings suggest that a reduction in fiscal deficit has an upward pressure on real interest rates in the economy and a depressing impact on the growth rate. Particularly, there is no evidence of a perverse impact of Keynesian fiscal activism in the economy. In recent times, Mishra 2021 elaborated how the Union Budget 2021-22 comprises a capex stimulus that brings in a multiplier accelerator interface, which sets up an investment income consumption spiral in the economy, and therefore we conclude that there are no unintended spillovers of this necessary measure for stimulating the economy. So with these remarks, I close my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anshuman. Thank you for keeping so perfectly to the time as well. I'd now like to invite the discussant, Piali Das. Piali, over to you. We don't hear you, Piali, in case you're speaking. Are you on? I'm not sure if you're on mute, but we can't hear you.
Can't hear you, Piali.
We can't hear you, Piali. Robbie, will you be able to check if Piali is somehow on mute?
Okay, I'm checking.
No. Piali, can we test your mic? Are you able to hear us? Can you respond in the chat? No, we are not able to hear you still. So, Pinaki, hello.
Yes, done. Yeah.
Any suggestions? Should we first take other any questions if there are, and then perhaps we can, get back to Piali once her mic is functioning?
Fine, absolutely fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let me invite other questions on this paper so that Anshuman can start thinking and responding while Piali gets her mic to function. If anyone has any questions, I think there must be a way to raise your hand. Or you can come on to unmute and you can speak.
Can I ask a clarificatory question? Anshuman?
Yes, of course.
When you say
Yes, sir.
perverse fiscal incentive, what does that mean? Is it more of consumption expenditure vis-a-vis capital expenditure, or is it that you're trying to say that composition of government expenditure matters and that determines growth? So I was not very clear. So if you could.
Thank you for your question, sir. I referred to perverse Keynesian fiscal activism, which essentially means that the way I looked at it is that Keynes said that government expenditure must come in to fill the output gap. So when I say perverse Keynesian fiscal activism, it means that instead of filling the output gap, it is actually widening it. So when actually you take back the fiscal deficit, the economy does well, and when you actually administer fiscal deficit, the economy is doing badly. This is what I meant, sir. And I hope that was clear now.
So does that mean that we have a pro-cyclical fiscal policy? Is that a fair conclusion?
Sir, again, my views are personal, and this is not the subject that I wanted to pursue here. But on a separate note, and my co-author Shri Rajiv Mishra is also in audience, and we did investigate the pro-cyclicality and counter-cyclicality of fiscal policy in India, and we did find that despite the FRBM, we are finding that a majority of the times we find pro-cyclicality in fiscal policy, and this is something even the chief economic advisor had also conceded. So I think that's a fair conclusion to make.
And you take both center and state and deficit, or is it the center's debt alone? When you do your data analysis.
So in this paper, it is only the centers.
Huh?
It is only the centers deficit.
Only the center's debt. Okay. Okay. Maybe a combined the same exercise taking combined debt and deficit could also give you some results which you could probably compare. So that not that you have to do it in this paper, but if it is not there, please mention that it is only about the center state, not about state. Because states' expenditure distribution patterns are very different than centers, right? So how that impacts growth, we do not know. So something, if you intend to examine, please take that state's aggregate debt and deficit also into consideration, which is as high as that of center's debt in terms of borrowing.
Noted, sir. I'll pursue this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, no, Piali, we still don't hear you. Would you like to reboot your machine? Maybe, it helps. because we are seeing you speak, but we can't hear you at all. We can't hear you, Piali, so perhaps you'd like to reboot your machine, take a couple of minutes, and then because you also have a presentation after this, so it would be good if you could just shut everything down and restart. Maybe it works. Okay. Okay, are there any other questions for Anshuman? So, Anshuman, I had one question. What are the implications of your result? So, based on your results, what would your basic advice be to the central government, since we are on that?
Ma'am, so my basic advice would be that sometimes we are scared of by economic analysis that fiscal deficit causes more harm than good in the economy, and therefore we must be very cautious and careful about fiscal deficits. My simple contention here is that instead of, I mean, this blanket statement is not exactly very correct, and we need more analysis to say that yes, fiscal deficit is causing more harm than good. Particularly in the current, in the prevailing circumstances, there is scope for fiscal activism, and therefore we should not shy away from this. This is my personal view, and this is my only submission here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We still can't hear Piali, so I think instead of her paper, while she sorts this out, perhaps we can move on to Sonalika, who's presenting a paper on nightlights, I believe. So the paper is titled Lights Out, COVID-19 Containment Policies and Economic Activity. The authors, she's co-authored this paper with Robert Baer and Tarun Jain. So over to you, Sonalika.
Good morning. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. And first of all, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. I'm Sonalika Sinha from Reserve Bank of India, and I'm here to present our paper called Lights Out, COVID-19 Containment Policies and Economic Activity. And this is, of course, joint work with Professor Tarun Jain at IIM Ahmedabad and Dr. Robert Baer from the World Bank. At the outset, I'd like to add that the views expressed in this paper are personal and do not reflect those of RBI or the World Bank. Okay, so this paper basically analyzes the impact of government containment measures, which is extremely critical to contain a pandemic such as the one that we are in right now. And these containment policies often differ in their impact depending on whether they're aggregate or whether they are targeted, and can have potentially large economic impact as well. So what we want to focus on is what is the disaggregated economic effects of the government containment strategies adopted in India last year, in which the districts were classified as red, orange, and green zones, if you remember. So that's where our focus would be. The outline of our paper is to estimate the impact of the graded unlock strategy, which is the red, orange, and green zone districts in India during May 2020, on the economic output as we measure that by the nighttime light intensity. To do this, we use a difference in differences strategy, comparing the districts with the most severe and stringent restrictions, which are the red zone districts, and the districts which had intermediate restrictions, which were the orange zones, comparing them with districts which had the least restrictions, which were the green zone districts. And we do this comparing the pre-period, which were months March and April 2020, versus the post-period, which were months May and June of 2020. So what we find as a preview of results is, in terms of magnitude, the nighttime light intensity, which is our proxy for economic activity, declined by 0.06 standard deviation for the red zone districts, This translates to approximately 9.3% decline in economic activity. Similarly, for the orange zone districts, the economic activity declined by 0.011 standard deviation, or a 1.5% decline compared to the green zone districts. Right, so one could argue that this result is fairly intuitive in terms of its direction, that when there's a containment policy, the economic activity is certainly likely to decline. But what we do in this paper is to analyze the magnitude of the effect and also look at some channels for example, what happened to not just economic activity, but what was the impact on mobility, income, and consumption at the household levels. Thereafter, we also discuss a bunch of robustness checks to check whether this indeed was the effect of the COVID containment policies. And we also do a lot of subsample analysis to see what was the district-specific characteristics that could potentially be driving these results. So the contribution of this paper is to estimate the differential impact of the containment policies adopted last year on the aggregate economic activity at the district level in India, and also to see what were the patterns in mobility, income, and consumption. And we also try to understand what were the underlying demographic, social, and economic factors that could be driving these effects. So in terms of timeline, I think it's fairly familiar to this audience what happened last year. So on March 25th of 2020, there was a uniform nationwide lockdown. So that was not differentiated across districts. The graded strategy happened on May 4th. That started on May 4th, in which the zones were classified as red, orange, and green zones. And that continued till May 31st. So the study period we look at is from March 2020 to June 2020. And the reason we include June is to potentially see any path dependence of the lockdown in that month. So what were these red, orange, and green, or the ROG as we call it? So the red zone districts were essentially districts in which there were restrictions on public transport, there were on hospitality and entertainment, construction, and retail. Further, there were restrictions in e-commerce limited only to supply of essential goods, and the private offices were working just with 1/3 employees at max. In contrast, the orange zone districts had some relaxations in public transport. And of course, the green zone districts were ones in which all activities resumed except the ones which were applicable nationally. So the way to interpret these zones would be to look at them as differential containment policies and also see what were the district-specific vulnerabilities in each of these. So here's a map of the red, orange, and green zones as we had it last year. And so if you see that they're fairly well distributed all throughout the country, and this gives us a very good setting to have a difference in differences approach for our methodology. Talking about the data sources, as I mentioned, we look at nighttime light intensity as our proxy for economic activity. And this is basically coming from NASA satellite information. And the benefit of this is that it's a fairly objective measure, and you don't have to really worry about any calculations of GDP accounting methods in this. And also, it's a very well-established proxy for economic activity in the literature. For zone classifications, we refer to the order by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare that came out on April 30th last year. For COVID infections, we look at the official website of covid19india.org. For the district-specific demographic information, we use the Shrug database. And also, we have a bunch of district-specific characteristics. For example, the banking deposits come from RBI's database. So here's a very brief summary statistics by zone classification, only of select variables. So if you notice across the red, orange, and green, there is considerable variation when you look at the first variable, which is the sum of lights per square kilometer, and similarly in number of infections per month as well. Thereafter, we also look at some household level variables, which are also differentiated across red, orange, and green. We look at monthly incomes and monthly consumption patterns. And finally, we also have mobility data. So we compare Google mobility and its several components that come with it. And we also look at Facebook mobility. Okay, so here's the empirical strategy for the paper. On the right-hand side, the coefficient beta 1 is for the red zone districts interacted with the post period. Beta 2 is the coefficient for orange zone districts interacted with the post period. XIT is basically a vector of district level monthly infections and also district level nighttime light intensity, which we control for since 2013 to 2019 to basically account for any seasonality effect in nighttime light intensity. Thereafter, we have a district fixed effect to basically control for any in-time invariant observable and unobservable district-specific characteristics. We also have a state-month interactive fixed effect, which is the most non-linear way of capturing any variation in state during, at the monthly level. And we also have a time fixed effect, which is a calendar month fixed effects. Finally, these standard errors are clustered at the state level because health is essentially a state subject, and this is also a fairly conservative way of getting our estimates. As far as the dependent variables are concerned, our primary variable is the nighttime light intensity, which is our proxy for economic activity, but we also substitute our dependent variable with other factors such as mobility, income, and consumption. So let me start by showing you the results for mobility, which as a dependent variable, and what was the impact of the containment policies on mobility. So as we would expect, if you look at the red zone districts in the month of May, mobility, declined consistently for all categories except that for grocery and pharma. So this is mainly, you can think of it as an essential activity for people to do, but the highest impact was that on workplace. So, people could not go to their workplaces, and that's why the mobility really declined. And this is also consistent with the Facebook mobility data. Similarly, in orange zones, we find that the impact declined except for grocery and pharma. And in the month of June, this effect starts to dissipate. So either it declined in magnitude or it actually turned positive because people could start going back to their offices and, started going out altogether. And further so for the orange zone districts in which the restrictions were much less stringent comparative to green. So, and now coming to the nighttime light intensity as our dependent variable, which really is the main order of our paper to see what was the impact on economic activity, we see that the red zones in the post period declined by 0.046 standard deviation compared to the green zone districts. And if you look at the month by month impact, so the red zone basically declined by 0.06 standard deviation in the month of May as compared to the green zones, and the orange zones also declined. In the month of June, the red zones, the decline in the red zones actually dissipated, and the decline came down from as compared to the month of May and comparing to the green zone districts. And also note that the R square is extremely high for our analysis, and this we think is because of the district level analysis. And also we account for the lagged per capita COVID infections and also the per capita COVID infections. And we have a bunch of variations, like when we include the COVID infection, and when we don't include it, also the results are fairly consistent. Thereafter, we have a bunch of robustness checks. So the first thing we do is we eliminate border districts in which basically the two districts which had the same zone or the same color, red or orange. We eliminate that because we want to remove any similarities due to the geographical proximity, and we only want to focus on what was the impact of the containment policy. In the second cut, we exclude the large districts, which were the 17 metropolitan cities, because we want to do away with the question that, hey, this could be the large cities that could be driving this effect on the economic activity. We also retain only the unchanged zones, because in between there were some 15 districts in which the state governments had the authority of changing the zonal classification, or they could have made it more strict. But we still drop it to see whether there is consistency, and we do find that. And finally, we have a placebo test in which we randomly shuffle the zone classifications to see whether it was indeed the effect of the zonal classification driving this result or not. And to our happiness, we find a null result. So here's the results of what I just mentioned. And if you notice column 4 for the shuffle zones, when the shuffle zones interact with the post period, we actually find a null effect. That means there's no effect of the containment policy, which was actually not put in place. And it was indeed the effect of the containment measures that was put in place by the government. Coming to the channels, we also look at income and consumption. So this is taken from CMIE household level surveys. So we find that in the red zone districts in the month of May, declined by 0.063 standard deviation in its income. And comparatively, the consumption effect was relatively lesser. So consistently we see, and similarly for the orange zone districts, it declined by 0.15 standard deviation in the month of May as compared to the green. So overall, we see that the income effect was much higher than the consumption effect, even though both were statistically significant. Now we have a bunch of subsample analyses in which we basically split our sample into above and below median of some district-specific characteristics. Taking population density, we find that districts with above median population density in the red zones declined by 0.091 in the post period compared to the green zones, comparative only to a 0.017 standard deviation decline in below median districts. So essentially, districts with higher population density were more affected. Similarly, districts with higher services employment were more affected, and the reason for this could be that districts with higher services employment would be more contact intensive, and them not being able to step out for normal activity would have a higher impact on their economic activity as well. Similarly, we also analyze based on age and financial activity. So we see that districts with above median average age, basically districts which were older in their demography, were the ones to be more affected, because we do expect that districts with higher share of senior citizens would be more affected due to the containment policies. And also districts with higher financial activity were the ones to be more affected. And there could be a whole lot of reasons behind this. Finally, we also look at migration, because this was a phenomenon very unique to India during the last year, to see whether there was any impact of the migration through the COVID-19 containment policies on economic activity. And we don't find a very significant effect of migration on the containment policies through the red and orange zone districts compared to the green zone districts. So to conclude, what we've done in this paper is to estimate a differential impact of the containment policies last year on aggregate economic activity in India at the district level. And we've exploited a graded unlock strategy in the month of May 2020 using a differences in differences design to estimate the impact of nighttime light intensity, which is our proxy for economic activity, mobility, and consumption patterns. We find that economic activity basically declined by 0.06 standard deviation for the red zone districts compared to green, and the orange zone districts declined by 0.011 standard deviation compared to the green zone districts. And in our heterogeneity, we find that districts with greater declines in above median formal employment, population density, average age, urbanization, and financial activity were the ones to be more affected. So that's our paper, and we welcome any comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malika. May I now invite Binod Behra, the discussant, to please take 5 minutes.
Hello.
Binod, over to you. Yeah.
Can you all quickly just hear me? This is Piali.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Hello. Hello.
Hello, Binod.
Hello.
Yes, we
good
can hear
morning.
you. Good
Am
morning.
I
Please
audible?
go ahead. Yes, you're audible. Please go ahead.
First of all, thanks, Sonali ma'am, for your nice and very informative presentation. And your paper, your study must focus on the very relevant topic, which is of the time. And analysis on the impact of government intervention measures to combat the infection, COVID-19, how that impacts economic activities across the different districts. And you have done a very comprehensive and detailed analysis of the impact of containment measures on economic activities, considering the possible for economic activities. And in your study, you have examined the effect of on economic activities, and you have seen differentiated, like you also consider the heterogeneity factors across different districts of India, and you also examine how the consumption and income of a household influenced by this policy, this containment policy. And you also consider both MGNREGA and mobility by considering Facebook and Google data location data. You have examined the effect of different policy by policy containment on the economic, on the mobility also. And in order to give a more comprehensive and robust, in order to prove the robustness of your estimation result, you have done the different, you have reshuffled your whole sample in different groups according to different characteristics. Like you have divided the whole sample into above population density on the basis of population density and service employment and mean age and the bank rate. And almost in all cases, you have found the consistent result, and result are more insightful also. But I have one queries or one doubt, that is, you have considered the nightlight data, and in case of India, more than 65% of the people live in rural area, and they are mainly focused on they earn their livelihood from the agriculture sector. Do you think that if we consider the light as a proxy for economic activity, it is a very popular proxy for economic activities across the world, but in Indian context, where more than around 70% people, more than 55% people, they live in the rural area, and more than 45% of Indian labor force, they're depending on agriculture. In this type of economy, do you think that this nighttime light policy is a good measure for GDP or economic activities? And if we, and another thing, so in your analysis, you have considered like population density and service employment and minimum age, and these are the other indicators. But I think, or I feel that you should consider like divide whole sample of districts into whether a particular group of districts are agriculture based or service based or industry based. On the basis of that, you should also look into it. This is one my suggestion. I feel this type of analysis may give more insightful. And this is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Binod. Can we have other questions for this as well? And then we'll go back to the authors. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
So,
Any questions? I have one question of my own, if there are no questions from anybody in the audience. Okay, so let me ask. So you have a 0.996 R square. Whenever I see an R square like 0.996, it puts you in the category of either something, being amiss, or into a place where there is nothing unexplained. Your variation is not, there is nothing almost unexplained. You have fully explained all reality, which I can see Tarun grinning away, which is a little disconcerting. So if you could just explain your left-hand side. You had said, Sonalika, that you were doing difference in difference. And if you could just, particularly given the R square of 0.996, you have differences of, from what I can understand, economic activity, differences in, so just if you could explain what the model is, so that one can understand where this explanation of 0.996 is coming from.
I can take both those questions if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah, sure.
First let me just, speak to Binod. And I think both these questions are very relevant and sort of central to our empirical exercise. The first point about night lights is that, at one level it was available. right? I mean, you have a massive pandemic happening, and a lot of the data collection machinery has just stalled, right? So a lot of standard measures of economic activity just weren't available. Whereas these satellites are going around the world, they're collecting data uninterrupted and in an unbiased way. And so there's no, question of, there's no perfect measure out there. This is a measure of economic activity, and it has its pluses and minuses. We think that there are several advantages of this measure. If, say, for example, there's a district which is heavily agriculturally reliant, and they don't use a lot of electricity, they don't have a lot of night lights, well, it's also reflective. I think there have been quite a few past studies which have addressed the fact that, well, then on a per land or per population basis, the amount of night lights that agricultural district generated is reflective of the economic value of those goods and services that were being collected. I mean, I'm not just saying that agriculture itself is on an aggregate basis unimportant. It's very important, but it does take up a lot of land and space, right? So when you divide the amount of night lights with the amount of space it takes up, then the night lights start to become a little bit accurate measure of the economic activity per unit land or in the districts, right? So in some ways, that's a point. Now, of course, you can question the elasticity of nightlight versus economic activity and ask whether that is the same in India versus in other contexts where nightlights have been used. It's not. There have been recent estimates, including by our distinguished co-author, Robert Bayer, right, who has examined precisely this question. And he's come up with some estimates, and those are the estimates for India that we have used in our paper. You can also ask yourself if the elasticity of nightlights to GDP or other measures of economic activity changed because of the pandemic, which is not something that Robert's earlier paper had addressed. I don't have that number, right? We don't have that number of how did the elasticity change over the time. In some ways what we've done in our paper is to provide a range of how much this could be. We've provided the middle of the range as our headline number that Sonalika presented, but we're, cognizant of these challenges of using nightlights. If you have a better measure, more reliable, accurate, precise measure of high frequency information at the district level during the pandemic, we'd welcome hearing about it, right? The CMI metric that we've used itself has pluses and minuses. Jean Drèze recently put out a series of articles in the Economic Times. Again, no perfect measure of anything, but the CMI data was available. CMI continued collecting data monthly in a panel of households. We can put in household fixed effects if you are concerned about, and we did put in household fixed effects if you're concerned about the characteristics of those households. So in that's our stand at the moment. We put together this paper within months of the first wave. So this is the data that's available. If you have suggestions on better data sources, we're more than happy to incorporate them. To get to Ila's point, the reason why that R-square is so high is because we put in every month of trailing night lights on the right-hand side as our baseline from March 2020 all the way till 2013, right? So any lagged effects of night lights, any lagged effect of this thing is captured because of that, right? So our outcome variable is also present on the right-hand side. In that sense, right? Plus we've put in district fixed effects. Plus we've put in state month fixed effects, right? So those factors explain a lot. After putting in all those factors on the right-hand side, I actually expected no effect of our monthly zonal classifications. Insofar that we do find this effect tells you how strong the effect of government containment policies last year was. It tells you how strong the economic impact of the COVID pandemic was. It was a 24% decline in GDP. I don't know of any other event in India that has ever had that. And then when the government containment policies come in differentially, you do see an effect. I mean, so we were surprised that our paper actually has a finding after that immensely high R-square.
Okay.
That addresses your point.
I think it would be nice to see some graphs of the variations that you see. So if you could add those, so that kind of, so if you have a variation of your night lights, for example, and you have variations in mobility and, so particularly night lights, because that would be convincing in the sense of, sometimes what happens is that actually what's going on in a regression is that for some reason, you're seeing no variation on both sides and you get a 0.996. So suppose, just for the sake of argument, suppose that we did not measure GDP properly. So I'm not saying that this happened, but I'm just saying in terms of thinking about a study. Suppose there was not much impact on GDP. Suppose there was zero impact on GDP. And suppose whatever was being captured by nightlights during these months, for whatever reason, maybe the reasons could be monsoons, the reasons could be something else. So if there was no variation on both sides, then also you might be getting these results. So just for convincing the readers that actually what we're seeing is high variation, and we are able to explain the entire variation almost.
I mean, the high variation point, I think, is well understood.
It would be useful as, to strengthen your paper. So that was the only thing I could think of. If there are no other questions, we'll move on to the next paper. Is Piali ready yet, or shall I move to the
Yes, I am, if it's okay.
Yeah, so we have a paper on public debt in India, titled Public Debt in India Security Level Analysis by Piali Das of IIM Indore and Professor Chetan Khate of ISI. And Piali, you are presenting the paper.
Yes, I am,
over
but
to you.
there's also a discussion that was due of Anshuman's paper.
Okay. So why don't we first finish yours and then we'll go back at the end to the discussion, because we've had one paper in the meanwhile. So we'll, at the end we'll take that up again. Is
Sure,
that okay?
absolutely.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. It's
So
my
let's have
screen.
your so let's have your paper now, Piali. Over
Thank
to
you
you.
so much. I'll just make it full screen. Good morning, everyone, and hello, everyone. So, and I'm really extremely sorry for the technical glitch. I was hoping this wouldn't come up, but unfortunately, one cannot just predict what's going to happen in these times and, using the technology. Okay, so the paper I'm going to talk about today is inflation's role in debt decomposition, a security level analysis in India. It's a joint work with Professor Chetan Khate from ISI Delhi. So before I jump into the paper, I'd just like to show you a picture, and this is from the IMF database, the Fiscal Monitor, where, as you can see here, it is showing the gross government debt as a percent of GDP for various country groups. The green line is of India. And as you can see, this is from the 90s all the way until, and I stop at 2018 because our analysis stops at 2018. So this blue line above is for the major advanced economies, G7. The cyan line is for advanced economies taken together. This red line is, of course, for the Euro area. And this line is for China, and this maroon line is for emerging markets and developing economies taken all together. So we all know that post the great financial crisis, most of these advanced nations have faced a surge, a peacetime surge in the debt to GDP. But this is not new for those advanced nations, because post World War II, let's say for the US, it was the debt to GDP was easily around 120%, and that did come down. But post the financial crisis, there was a debt surge again. And so these advanced nations, given the state demographics, they saw a surge in their debt to GDP. But India, being an emerging nation, as you can see here, is also inching towards a high debt level. And I'll show you the numbers in a bit. And of course, this is higher compared to, all of the emerging markets taken together. By the way, one clarification, the one that you see for China is of course just public debt, and it is not showing you the overall debt that contains also the private debt, which is of course much higher, but this is just public debt. So in comparison, of course, I mean, India is lower in terms of its debt to GDP currently, I mean, or as of, let's say 2018, compared to advanced nations, but of course it's higher compared to its peers in terms of its emerging market and developing economies. And that gave us one big reason to essentially dig into what could be some of the reasons that's driving the debt dynamics in India. So coming to a little background about India. So a watershed moment in India's post-independence era was, of course, the economic reforms and the liberalization that happened in 1991. And of course, subsequently, we did experience a high GDP growth rate of around 8%. And then there was a Fiscal Reform and Budget Management Act, or the FRBM in short, in 2003, which was put in place, which meant that the center and the state would be on a glide path to kind of contain their deficits to 3 to 4% of GDP. So that was like a fiscal rule or a fiscal discipline that was put in place. Then, of course, and that was on the fiscal front. And then, of course, India becomes an inflation targeter in 2014. And of course, in 2014, it was a de facto year, and the actual law came into place in 2016. So that was the de jure year, and therefore I just put in both these years, 2014 and 2016. So given that India has a fiscal rule in place as well as a monetary policy rule in terms of its fiscal inflation targeting, and despite India being an emerging economy, is currently, and of course, I looked at the current numbers, and it's about 90% of GDP, the debt to GDP ratio. But as of 2018, it was the debt, gross debt as a share of GDP was about 58%. And if you take in all of the liabilities in addition to the debt, it of course stands at a 68%. Now, of course, in comparison, the gross debt to GDP for advanced economies was about 104% as of 2018, but given the emerging and middle income, it was about 51. So clearly we were higher compared to the emerging and the developing peers of India. So given this, this scenario, what we do essentially in this paper is we then try to analyze the components that affect the debt to GDP ratio for India. And we do that using aggregate level debt data. And we have a longer time series for that. And of course, the next step is, looking at a security level debt data. And in order to use that security level debt data, we follow Hall and Sargent's methodology that they have put forth in their 1987 as well as 2011 paper. And following the Hall and Sargent methodology, we then decompose the debt into its various components. So we considered the decomposition of public debt portion of the liabilities. We undertake the decomposition for par value or the face value of debt, or the debt as we call it. And of course, we decompose the debt using the security level debt data, and we restrict ourselves to the center and states only. Okay. And what comes out, and I'll show you in a moment through an equation, the different components that affect the debt to GDP ratio between any two time periods, of course, the normal interest rate, inflation, rate of GDP, and the primary deficit or the surplus. So given this framework, the main contribution that we have when we're looking into such a paper is that we assemble the aggregate level public debt database for India. And of course, it is available from various publications in India, but we have a comprehensive list where we do cross-checking across these various publications, and then we come to this number. So there is some work done that we do, and we add value to that in terms of collecting and assembling and collating the aggregate level public debt database for India. We also assemble a security level debt data for the center and all of the states from 2000. For the center, it goes from 2000 until 2018, but for the states, we could only get reliable data. We could get our hands on reliable data only from 2004 onwards, and our decomposition exercise therefore starts from 2005 until 2018. And of course, using this data that we collect, we then examine the drivers of public debt in India between 1959 and 2018 for the general government debt. And I'll come to in a moment, you can see what the general government debt means. So in terms of the outline, what I'll do is I'll quickly give a snapshot of the stylized facts in terms of the public debt data, as well as the liabilities and how it kind of tallies between the states and the center. We then look at the debt decomposition very briefly, equation that I use, followed by the results from the aggregate debt decomposition, as well as the security level decomposition. And then we try to see if public debt in India is sustainable, and followed by some checks about debt liquidation and volatility. So in terms of data sources, the general government debt data comes mostly from RBI and the Ministry of Finance's status paper, and of course the budget documents that we had to fall back on in order to do some cross-checking. The national accounts data, inflation, etc., inflation, GDP, etc., comes from RBI, and of course NIPFT has been a big help in that regard. Security level central government debt comes from Ministry of Finance's status papers that they started coming out from 2010 onwards. And for the security level state government debt data, we fall back on state finances, RBI auctions data, the SGL data that RBI also kind of puts out in the public domain, and to do some cross-checking, we also look at the RBI press releases in order to just track those securities to get a correct number for the debt. We would also need the yield to maturity data, and for that we of course fall back on RBI's yield to maturity data. So given that, coming to the stylized facts quickly, if you look at India's public debt, and this is for the center, so the central government liabilities include debt against the Consolidated Fund of India, which is commonly known as the public debt, and of course the liabilities in the public account. So as of end March 2018, the public debt was about 41% of GDP, and liabilities constituted 5.5% of GDP. And public debt is further divided into internal debt and external debt for the center, of course, and internal debt is the bigger chunk of that debt, which is about 38% of GDP, and it constituted 93% of total central public debt as of March 2018. And of that internal debt, marketable debt is again a sizable portion. It's about 87% of the internal debt. And there's also something called a non-marketable debt. And the components are the National Small Savings Fund, NSSF, international financial institutions, POLIF, that's post office, accounts, RPOLIF, rural post office accounts, compensation other bonds, 14-day intermediate treasury bills, etc. Now coming to the external debt, this is the debt raised from outside of the territory of India, and it's and as of 2018, it was about 2% of GDP. And if you look at it as a percentage of the total center liabilities, which includes both the debt as well as the liability, was about 6%. So it's predominantly borrowed in three currencies: SDR, USD, and yen. And in fact, for the external debt, there are two ways one can look at external debt. One which is valued at the book value at historical exchange rates, or one that is valued in current exchange rates. But we could not get our hands on the current exchange rate data, so we use the historical exchange rate data in order to kind of do our analysis with the debt. So that's how it is. And to quickly show you the center's debt and liabilities, and this is in levels. So the green line is of course showing you this the total center liabilities, and the blue line is the center public debt, and the red line is of course the center's other liabilities portion. So clearly public debt constitutes the higher of the two components, and for our analysis we exclusively look at the public debt portion because that is associated with the deficit portion, and I'll come to it in a moment. Coming to the state debt, the Constitution of India empowers the state governments to borrow only from domestic sources, which means that the state governments are not allowed to borrow externally. And for the state debt, so again, there's this classification of the marketable and the non-marketable. And again, the marketable is the sizable portion of the total state's debt. And as you can see here in this figure, where the blue line is the total state debt, and of course, that's the non-marketable, and that's the marketable portion. So clearly, the marketable portion of the state's debt is the sizable portion in terms of the state's debt. And of course, there's the state public accounts, there's state provident fund, reserve funds, deposits, advances, etc. So given this feature, if you look at the government's liabilities in India, which includes debt issued against, which is essentially the public debt, as well as other liabilities, as we call it. So total liabilities is the sum of the public debt and other liabilities, and clearly public debt was about 57%, and if you add on these other liabilities, it becomes about 73% as of 2018. And for general government debt, what we did was, in order to get that number, we took the center's debt, we added the state's debt, and we took other states' investment of the treasury bills of the center, which happens. And then, of course, the loans that comes from the center goes to the state. So given this definition of the general government debt, then what we have is, on the left panel, you can see the blue line is showing you the total liabilities, the way it has been evolving since the 50s all the way until 2018. And that's the red line is the general government debt and how it has been evolving. Coming to, on the right panel, I also add the states. So as you can see here, the states have also, it is rising as of, 2018, 2017, 2018 period. But clearly the center's debt is much higher. So given this, the framework that I use is, of course, the simple government budget constraint. And by a simple manipulation of that government budget constraint, one can arrive at an equation like 1, where BT is the real value of debt issued by the government to the public, YT is the real GDP at time T, R is the nominal interest rate, pi is the inflation rate, G is the growth rate of GDP, and there is a deficit term, and you can just iterate on this. Oh, by the way, the deficit is, of course, the primary deficit, which is less of interest payments, because we're already accounting for payments, so we just look at the primary deficit. So we can just iterate on this equation, and then we have this decomposition equation where we look at, we can just go tau periods back and look at the difference in the debt to GDP between periods T and T minus tau. And then the components that come out are RT minus 1 minus J times the T minus 1 minus J. So that's the first component, or the interest component, the inflation component multiplied by the debt over the debt that is due. There's GDP growth rate, and of course the deficit. So clearly from this decomposition equation, anytime there's a rise in the nominal interest rate or there's a rise in the deficit, it's going to add to the debt burden. And anytime there's inflation and growth and primary surplus, of course, it's going to bring down that change in the debt. So given this equation, and of course, one important thing is that this kind of a decomposition is very, sensitive to the time periods that we choose. And so we had to be careful about that. So here is the first result from the aggregate debt decomposition. So what we do first is, of course, start in the end periods, and we start from 1959 because we had big data set for 1959 only. And these are roughly 90 periods that we look at. And clearly, see here, there's a big role that inflation plays here. So this is straight out of that equation. And so this change in the debt to GDP is essentially decomposed into these 4 components. But in addition to that, we also have something called a residual, because, collecting these data, and of course, the interest rate that we are using, effective interest rate, and this is not at and typically the debt that you have is a composition of different maturities. And what we're using here is effective interest rate. So clearly, it will not be a good measure, and that adds to the residual. And also, there's various definitions, there are errors in these measurements, and that adds to the residual. So if you add all of these 5 columns, you will arrive at a change. So that's one thing that we want to point out also in an aggregate debt analysis is, if you do a decomposition using the aggregate debt data, you are going to, face this thing called a residual. But nonetheless, I mean, given that we had a longer time, we then went ahead and did the decomposition. We saw that, the contribution of inflation, as you see, is going up. And especially this is true for the high inflation years that this sub-period kind of houses. So, and of course, growth also was playing a big role. But then the deficit, earlier, whereas it was to some extent to burden over time after FRBM, of course, the contribution of ineffective GDP went down. So we don't stop there. We then look at the administered interest rate. So there are these, there was a policy whereby the government was kind of administered that was there in the economy, especially tweaking the loan, the rate on the loan that the banks were giving. So that administered interest rate went away around mid, and so therefore we choose that time period, 1997. And we can see that even though the administered interest rate was, away, yet the contribution did not come down, and the contribution was in fact higher in terms of how nominal rate were affecting the debt. We also look at the effect of FRBM in this decomposition, and we do see that if we slice the data as for 2003, we find that if you look at the deficit column, it did come down. The contribution of deficit affecting the debt did come down. Coming to the inflation targeting year, and we choose the de jure year, the 2014, and we do see that again the contribution of inflation also coming down substantially because of the institution of a flexible inflation target. Now, we then move on to the security level debt data. And for that, what we do is we fall back on the modern theory of the term structure of interest rates, which lets you look at a security, and especially, if it's coupon, if it is coupon, then you can look at each of these coupon as a zero coupon bond. Individually, you can just price them, and then you can add up that bundle to give you that whole the value of that whole bundle, and that can and so that is also another way of looking at the market value of the. And can someone tell me how I'm doing with time, because I would then go into this definition, or
You can go on till 10:50. Well, 10:50. Your time was till 10:15.
okay,
But
so
I
I'm
guess you
over
can take another, so you can take maybe another 2-3 minutes more.
2-3 minutes. Okay, so then I'm going to skip this. Thank you so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip the definition of these variables, which is there in the paper. So, and quickly, I'll just show you the results. By the way, this is the nominal payouts is a share of GDP that we see, and this is for the central debt, central securities, and we see that there is a reduction in the maturity structure of the debt that's happening for India, and I think the average maturity is now about 15 years. Now, coming to the decomposition result of the security level debt data, and I'm showing you for the center because of the lack of time, but center and the states, but qualitatively the results remain the same, and so I'm just going to talk about the center securities. So again, one good thing about the security level data is that we can then back out the nominal return on the non-marketable portion of the debt. And we do see that when we take the whole period together, clearly, there's a big role that inflation is playing. A nominal interest rate is higher on both the marketable as well as the non-marketable portion, and of course, growth. So inflation, growth do stand out, and of course, nominal return also are higher. Now, if you look at the years when growth was high, 2005, around this time, or in these periods, the growth rate is having a big contribution. But if you look at the high inflation years, which is housed in 2009 to 2014, inflation does play a sizable role here as well. Okay. And of course, post FRBM, the role of primary deficit does come down. That is what we see. Now, a good thing about this analysis is that it gives you a freedom to kind of do this analysis across different maturity tranches. And if we do that, so you can just look at what the breakup was on 1 to 2 year maturity, 2 to 10 and 10 plus. And what we see importantly is that between 2009 and 2014, the high inflation years, the real rates, so you can just look at the nominal return on one particular maturity tranche, and then the inflation number to get the return, and clearly the real returns were negative on all these maturity tranches that we looked at. So that is one thing. I'm not going to get into these results. When we do the debt sustainability check, we do find that both for the aggregate level debt, we are sustainable because, of course, the growth component or the growth rate is higher than the effective interest rate that we use for the aggregate decomposition, and also from the security level, except for this 1 year, otherwise mostly we are good in terms of R less than G. For sustainability. In terms of volatility, we do find that post-rate, the volatility of all components go down. And we also look at co-movements of 3 variables, essentially the household savings, assets as a percentage of GDP, real effective exchange rate, and an uncertainty index from Baker Davis. And we do see that, inflation. Here is a picture. So the first panel is showing you the co-movement of the household savings as well as the growth rate and inflation. So one is for the inflation component and the other is for the growth component. So, but there's no conclusive, co-movement here in terms of the household savings. But if we look at how uncertainty index and inflation has been behaving, clearly, they are moving in the same, there's a positive co-movement and a negative co-movement of the growth component with the uncertainty, which is what, is evident from given, the uncertainty and the growth and the inflation. Coming to rear, there's a negative co-movement between inflation and RER and a positive one with growth. So given this, then quickly to summarize, we assemble this data and we find that, from the decomposition that inflation and growth has been important in affecting the debt dynamics. And of course, in the pre and the post FIT, the volatility the volatility goes down post FIT. And of course, there is a link between, how inflation co-moves with uncertainty, and the RER shows, some degree of fiscal dominance affecting the debt dynamics as well. So I think I'll stop there, and I think I've gone over with this presentation.
Thank you, Piali. Tarun, may I now invite you to give your discussion comments, please?
Hello, can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you, Tarun.
Can you see my slides?
Yeah, we can see
Okay,
your
great.
slides.
Let me just quickly summarize what this paper is about. In some ways, Piali has done a great job in already presenting her paper. So you don't really need to hear much more from me about what this paper is about. But one thing which is very obvious is how much work went into collecting all this data, right? You would imagine that data on public debt, this is government-held debt, is easily and is easily available, well organized, everything. And what I discovered by reading this paper is that it's not, and that someone put in a lot of effort, and the authors put in a lot of effort into getting this data together and then conducting this exercise. So that is truly impressive and sort of standout contribution of this paper. Main result is that inflation is important, but then there are many more results as well, which I think the macroeconomists should be concerned about. Now, if this paper was being presented in the finance ministry, if this paper was being presented in the RBI, I think it's perfect, and I have really nothing more to add, right? Now, of course, Piali knows that I'm not a macroeconomist, so let me say that with that in mind, here are some thoughts that I had when I was reading the paper, as just an economist in India who is interested in this topic. So first point is really about exposition, which is that I would like there to be much more foregrounding of your economic question and your contribution in answering that question. What you've foregrounded is your data exercise. It really is impressive how much work goes into the data, but I would still like you to foreground the value of the question rather than the data, right? So explain why is this empirical exercise critical? Why is it that it's so important to do it in the context of India? Because it has been done in the context of other countries, particularly the US before, right? So for example, could inflation dynamics be different for India compared to other countries? You're looking at a number of macroeconomic reforms. To what extent were they unique and specific to India compared to other countries also forming other similar kind of reforms? Could it be how these reforms impact public debt be unique or consistent with the experiences of other countries? And so if yes, they are unique, then your problem is how do we generalize? And I'll just speak about this in a minute, right? And so I think a little bit of an answer to this is to think a little bit more in theory terms and to think of your grand macro model and what is the component of that grand macro model that you contribute towards, right? So which is the part of that macro model which is more salient in the context of India, which is less salient, and how do your empirical estimates plug into the theory to provide validity to theory or to say that this theory is not so important, right? So now that is really exposition. now I'm putting on my referee hat, right? So it's like you pick some specific factors. Inflation impacts public debt. I mean, that's everywhere, not so surprising. But some of the other macroeconomic reforms, they might be India specific. And now I'm putting on my mean referee hat. I'm saying, you pick those reforms to form favorable results, right? So on one hand, you pick those ones, so you get a result. In fact, you could have picked, I bet you could have picked even more, found those didn't have a result, then foregrounded these, right? So, well, okay, fine. You could rewrite your paper and say, let's be honest, there are a large number of reforms in India and elsewhere. We could have looked at all of them, right? Then your mean referee will say, you're analyzing factors which have little relevance to the situation, right? Fine. Okay, fine. Then you say that, look, I'm picking those which have relevance to the situation. Then the mean referee will say, fine, these have relevance to this situation, but then what about external validity, right? So think about how you're going to address your mean referee. I'm not going to be a referee. You can be confident of that. So, you know, this is how a little bit of the referee will ask you about, and I think a little bit of, you know, perhaps shadow boxing with that referee in advance and addressing these points up front might help your paper in the journals, right? But if it's the finance ministry or the RBI, already good to go.
Thank you, Tarun.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tarun. Before I ask Piali to respond, I had a couple of comments, and then I'm going to ask others for questions. So, Piali, first of all, I think that's a very important date that you pick out is 2014, and you say that that was de facto inflation targeting. Now, since I was in the ministry at that time, so and you know, this is all public information, so let me share that with you. In 2014, there was actually no de jure or de facto inflation targeting at all. In fact, in 2014, we spent, that we means the Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs, and the Reserve Bank of India spent time discussing that there should be one. And then on 20th of February, 2015, something called the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement was signed between the Ministry of Finance and the RBI. Now, in this Monetary Policy Framework Agreement, at best, you can say that is, even though that was not a change in the law, and we did not set up the MPC at that time. So the MPC was set up only in 2016, as you know, when the when the RBI Act was amended. Okay. But from 2015 onwards, at best, you could say that India moved to inflation targeting. You can certainly not say that for 2014. Okay. So that was one, because it struck me, and this was like, really, I was in it. So I just wanted to correct you on that. Please correct that.
Sure.
There is no justification for 2014 as being the inflation targeting year. The second, I think, please, I would say, let's look at this in the literature. That's one thing that struck out as missing. And I'm sure, any referee would tell you that, but also, one just wants to know. So what have other people done? What have they found? Maybe, you seem to suggest that nobody has done this for India. Maybe somebody has done it just for central government debt, maybe not. But it's very good to show that, look, this is what the literature is. And yeah, this is the gap in the literature, and this is how we locate ourselves in the literature. And even when you come to your results, because your results are particularly for the inflation tax being what it was, and that was a period, at least up till 1997, when the Ways and Means Agreement was signed between the RBI and the ministry, that there was a lot of discussion on inflation tax. And that there was a lot of literature on this, and there were papers throughout that early period before the signing of the WMA. So, locating it, that would perhaps help, the reader to see where it is. Now, I don't want to go on. I think we'll take a couple of quick questions and then give you time to respond, and then we'll have to move on to the next paper. So any questions, please?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, Lekha, please go ahead.
Thank you. Piyali, it's brilliant. My question relates to the structure of maturity of debt, because in India, at the subnational governments and of course RBI also, we have seen a pattern in which, postponing the refinancing risks and going towards a longer term, debt maturity structure. So if from your analysis, what is that inference? What is that policy perspective that in the time of pandemic, are we doing the right thing? Because in the Operation Twist, it happened like simultaneously buying and selling of that, short and longs. And even some of the subnational governments, they are not with, any factors, but with the structure, the maturity structure of the debt. So what is your perspective? Are we doing the right thing? Because of course, but you are postponing the question.
Voice is cracking. So if I understand correctly, then you want to have a sense.
Maybe Piyali, we can take other questions and then you can respond to all three so far, and any others if there are any. We're tight on time. Any other questions? Okay, Pinaki. No, sorry, Piyali, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Should I start with Tarun's questions in that order?
Yes. So just take about 1 minute. Sorry.
Yeah. So yes,
have your.
Yeah, if I could just have Tarun's slides, that would be really helpful. So I could just use it as a reference. Thank you. Yes, second slide. Yeah, the one. Yeah, so the empirical exercise is critical because we wanted to get to know, and this is again, this is an accounting exercise. We're not saying anything causal with this data. So at best, it's a correlation. So we just wanted to get a sense of where these, components, how they kind of line up in terms of their contribution towards debt to GDP. So that was really where we started. And in terms of, and then we found that inflation was playing a big role, but then post-FIT, its effect was going down. And so therefore, inflation playing a role became important for us, and also growth to some extent. But because there is this monetary policy rule in terms of the FIT, which is in place, we thought, looking at it from that perspective might be helpful. Because inflation did play a big role in affecting the debt dynamics. So, and we didn't find it in the previous literature. In terms of the decomposition, of course, in terms of inflation, you would find a lot of literature like Professor Patnaik pointed out. But again, with the decomposition, how these things line up was not that. There's a paper by Rangarajan who did that, and also Patel and Buiter did that. But again, that was a bit dated, and so we wanted to get a sense of how things are with a longer time series, and to see, and especially focus on how these things line up in terms of the debt to GDP. So that is why we have inflation, and of course, because we could look at these different time periods, we thought, why not we look at it in terms of how these macroeconomic policy reforms played any role, if any, at all, they had any bite on the debt dynamics, and that's all we did. But again, we could do it only for the aggregate debt because we had a longer, and we tried our best to take that state security level debt data back, but unfortunately reliable data. So we went back and forth with, you can think of all the institutions that we went to, and we were shuttling, but we could not, and therefore our security level only starts from 2000, which is reliable. And what we did was we looked at all these securities and we made sure they added up to the aggregate debt data that was out there. So, for our reliable data only starts from 2000, and we could not do that for security level as well. Okay, and thank you so much. This was really helpful in terms of what the referees would come back with. We are really thinking hard about, how to place it in the literature so that, we can, handle that question. Thank you very much, Tarun. These were really useful comments there. Yeah, okay, so coming to Professor Patnaik, and thank you so much for pointing out that 2014 was not that important a year, but 2015 might be, and I can easily change that to 2015 and see how things kind of change in that regard. So thank you very much for pointing that out. And the other thing is about inflation tax again. I mean, of course, we will look into that literature, and so it's still a working paper, and we're still kind of trying to write it in a way that is useful for scholars and academics and policymakers. And so definitely thank you so much for that. Coming to Lekha ma'am's question about the structure of subnational debt. Now we stop at 2018. So if we look at the debt, state level debt from 2004 until 2018, it was mostly the 10-year SDLs which were issued, but post 2018, I did not update the data. So I'm not really sure, but again, there's this literature that talks about that if the government is going for longer debt, then of course there could be a role for inflation in trying to, liquidate that debt. But then if it is going for shorter, maturity structure, then it implies some kind of a rollover risk that the government might face. So maybe in the pandemic, we stopped before the pandemic years. So if you look at it, maybe it is going down. And if you look at that picture that I showed you for the nominal payouts as a share of GDP, and that is for the center state securities, because there's more variation in the security level data for the center. And of course, center data is higher. Also, that makes another reason why we look at center state.
I'll have to stop you. We've got 2 minutes left for the last paper, so we can't. So sorry about this. Yeah, thank you. May I now invite Binod Behra to present his paper on the effect of fiscal deficit on economic growth performance of Indian states, and you have 15 minutes to present.
Hello.
Yeah, hello, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, all. Today's topic of my presentation is effect of fiscal deficit on economic growth performance of Indian states. This is the total overview of my today's presentation. And let's start with introductions. The orthodox theory of public finance is based on the ideas of limited role of the government in economic activities. However, with the emergence of Keynesian theories, the concept of compensatory finance and government borrowing gained the limelight in enhancing aggregate demands and macroeconomic stability. And government and the role of the government spending plays a vital role in increasing with the increase in the function of the governments across the different economies. And the budget deficit at the center and the state level of government was very much under control and producing surplus for the early 30 years of India's independence. And in Indian budgeting systems, the major changes happens with the appearance of revenue deficit in the central budget since 1980s. And again, due to the large fiscal and external sector imbalances, the idea of fiscal deficit made its first appearance in the Economic Survey of 1990-91 under the IMF Structural Adjustment Programs. To achieve the fiscal discipline, the Parliament of India passed Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act in 2003, which prescribed the limit for the fiscal deficit at 3% of GDP by 2008-9 and sought to abolish the revenue deficit permanently to achieve the fiscal consolidation. Following the FRBM bill, different states also passed their respective fiscal responsibility legislation and imposing similar limit on the fiscal deficit and revenue deficit as well. However, the idea of this adoption, the rule-based policy, is derived from the Maastricht Treaty fiscal rules implementation by the UN member countries without having any underlying rational approach or empirical analysis. India also adopted the similar kind of policy. This is contested to many experts due to the differential economic condition characterizing by European Union countries and India. And there is no justification where this 3% fiscal deficit to GDP ratio is applicable for India. And but the main of this fiscal main of this FRA and FRBM Act is to achieve the fiscal consolidation which ensures higher economic growth. And theoretically, there are three schools of thoughts which provide contradictory views on the growth effect of fiscal deficits. According to neoclassical peoples, deficit have a detrimental impact on economic growth. However, Keynesian argues that it stimulates economic growth. And Ricardian people, the Ricardian equivalent theorem argues that the fiscal deficit has neutral effect on the economic growth. And according to neoclassical people, the fiscal deficit hamper economic growth if the private saving does not fully compensate for the decline in the government savings. And this increase the interest rate. As a result, the investment fall and ultimately it reduced economic growth. And in this paradigm, with the increase in the fiscal deficit, which leads to the rise in the lifetime consumption through the postponement of taxes from current period to future period. And in a closed economy, if there is a full employment, and then any increase in the consumption would cause for the decline in the saving. Hence, it hurts economic. And in an open economy, with the increase in the deficit through the external sources, that may keep the level of investment and the rate of interest unchanged in the economy, but the domestic currency may appreciate, and that reduce export, and which ultimately reduce economic growth. And there are empirical studies which support the neoclassical thoughts. And in Keynesian views, the Keynesian viewed that in the presence of unemployment and idle resources, a rise in the deficit finance government expenditure would cause for an increase in the output through a multiplier process. And Bernheim rejected the Keynesian argument that if in the economy, if there is a full unemployment in the economy, then this fiscal deficit hampers the economic growth. And they also argued that rise in the fiscal deficit would improve the profitability of the private investment by increasing the aggregate demand, that in turn further increase the private investment and corresponding to any interest rate, and that hampers the economic growth. And that boosts economic growth in the economy. And Ricardian people argued that the fiscal deficit have a neutral effect on the economic growth, and the fiscal deficit in any current period is equal to the present value of the future taxations, so that a rational individual can anticipate the present value of future taxes as the government collect revenue by imposing taxes. So the timing of taxation does not matter. The lifetime income and consumption matters. Therefore, there is no real effect of fiscal deficit on economic growth. There are several studies which supports the argument of Ricardian peoples, but Ghatak into 1995 and 96 paper, they argued that the Ricardian views is not valid in case of India by doing some empirical analysis. And we have done empirical literature review on empirical analysis, and we divided the whole empirical literature into three parts, and some literatures argued that supports the Keynesian views. Another group of literatures argued the objective of this paper is to empirically examine the effect of fiscal deficit on economic growth performance of the major selected states in India. And we have collected data from the EPWRF and RBI on fiscal variables such as tax revenue, non-tax revenue, and gross fiscal deficit. And we have collected other data like private investment and inflation from RBI and GSTP data also from RBI and from other. And this is the descriptive statistics of the variables that we are considered. And in case of unitary test, we check for the panel unitary test, and we found that gross fiscal deficit and gross enrollment in primary and secondary education are the two variables which are coming significant stationarity at level, and other variables are non-stationarity at level, but stationarity at first difference. And empirically, we have derived the basic regional economic growth model from different literatures, and here we have applied the three panel data model to see the three distinct effects of the relationship between fiscal deficit and economic growth. We have applied the panel fixed effect model to see the linear relationship between fiscal deficit and economic growth, and we have applied threshold effect model, panel threshold effect model, to see the non-linearity between these two variables and the non-linear impact of fiscal deficit. And for the robustness check, we have applied panel RDL model by replacing the dependent variable with the absolute per capita income instead of per capita income growth rate in the RDL model. And we have, in the panel fixed effect model, we have estimated three variant of models. And in first model, the per capita income growth is the function of gross fiscal deficit, tax revenue, non-tax revenue, and private investment, inflation, and human capitals. And in the second model, we have incorporated to policy domain, time domain, and in the third model, we have incorporated the interaction of policy domain with gross fiscal deficit to see how the fiscal deficit affecting economic growth after the implementation of these two policies. And this is the result of panel fixed effect model, and we found that all models are fixed effect model that we are confirmed from the Hussman test, and it is found that an 1% increase in the gross fiscal deficit would reduce the per capita income growth rate by 0.99%. And this finding is akin with the neoclassical arguments, and it is also confirmed from the table that non-tax revenue, tax revenue, inflation rate have a negative and significant impact, and it is consistent with the theory. However, gross enrollment in primary education and private investment have a positive impact on the economic growth rate of the states, but gross enrollment in secondary education has turned out to be insignificant. And in the second model, the FRL policy has a positive impact on economic growth. However, the economic policy reforms has no any significant impact on economic growth. And in the third model, however, when we take the interaction of FRL with GFT, then it has a negative impact on economic growth rate, but the coefficient is very less as compared to the absolute value of absolute gross fiscal deficit, which indicates that the negative effect of fiscal deficit is very less in the post-FRL periods. And after that, we have also estimated the
Binod, please may I ask you to wrap up? We want to finish at least by 11 o'clock. So I'll need to give some time to your discussant also. So please, can you wrap up?
Here we have applied the panel threshold effect. This is the beauty of this model, is that it decides the threshold value endogenously, which is more appropriate over the conventional exogenous threshold regression techniques. And we have here applied the Hansen method of threshold panel effect. First of all, here we checked for the single threshold effect, and it is coming significant, and so that we reject the null hypothesis and accept the single threshold. After that, we go for the double threshold effect and triple threshold effect. Triple threshold effect, and we found that in case of triple threshold effect, it is coming insignificant, so that we accept the null hypothesis, and there is a double threshold effect. And here we got the threshold value, that is 2.25 and 2.75. And here the estimated result. Here we have shown both the panel fixed effect model and panel threshold fixed effect model for a comparative analysis, and all other results like gross fiscal deficit, tax revenue, non-tax revenue, and all variables are coming as expected. And the threshold panel effect model, threshold fixed panel effect model, confirm that when the GDP lies within 2.25, then 1% increase in GDP enhance the growth in economic growth by 0.9%. However, when this threshold level increase from lies between 0.25 to 2.25 to 2.75, then it's positive impact reduced to 0.81. And if you see the gross fixed effect, that is minus 1.01, it indicates that when the fiscal deficit lies within the particular threshold limit, it has a positive impact, and when it exceeds that threshold limit, it has the negative impact. And here we have applied the pooled mean panel, that is also known as the panel data model, to see the long-run relationship between fiscal deficit and economic growth. And here we are only presenting the long-run estimated result. And here also we found that there is this ECM, the significant and negative coefficient of ECM.
Vinod, may I please request you to wrap up? May I please request you to wrap up? You have taken 18 minutes, so I may request you to wrap up.
It is also found from the ARDL estimation result. It is also found that the gross fiscal deficit also have a negative impact, and that impact is very much higher as compared to the short-run periods. It indicates that in the long run also there is positive impact, but after the implementation of FRL policy, it has a positive impact on economic growth. And the major findings and conclusion is that there is a negative impact of GFT on economic growth. But when it lies within the limit, then it has a positive impact on economic. And when the fiscal deficit and the FRL policy has a positive impact on economic growth, however, economic policy reform has no effect on economic growth. And the ARDL model also revealed that GFD have a negative impact in the long run, and when the interaction variables of FRL and GFD confirm that relatively the negative impact is less in the post FRL periods. And this is the overall result and conclusion. From here, I just wind up the presentations.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Anshuman, do you think you can do a quick job in 2 minutes?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon. Good morning to one and all. I compliment Shri Behera on this fantastic paper that explores the effect of fiscal deficit on economic growth of Indian states. Let me not delve into the great details, because he has already spoken about it in great detail just recently. Let me just enumerate 2 points that I wanted to make. One particular finding that holds much significance in my view in this paper is that the impact of fiscal responsibility legislations on determining the relationship between fiscal deficit and economic growth has been duly noted. In fact, it runs contrary to findings reported in one of the economic surveys that FRLs have actually not been very economically significant, apart from having reduced the fiscal deficit for a few years, and subsequently that effect faded. And this particular piece of research by Shri Behera has run counter to that view, and I think it is a reason for us to cheer that yes, FRLs have been significant for us economically speaking. Let me stop here and then just give 3 suggestions for Shri Behera to work on, if he deems them useful enough, of course. So the first is that the states chosen for the analysis may be explicitly named, and the criteria for choosing them may be clearly explained. He mentioned that there are 14 major states, and what is the specific reason for choosing these states, that may be explicitly stated. Second, he has used per capita income data, and as I understand, from 1981 to 2015, the period of his analysis, actually it straddles multiple base years for the national accounts data. So what was the preferred option for bringing them all to a common base year? That may be described for the use by readers. The third point, and this is my last, is that apart from the strategy he has adopted for finding the various thresholds for fiscal deficits and their asymmetric impact on economic growth, maybe he can consider choosing the cumulative sums and cumulative sum square method test to see if the thresholds for parameter stability as inferred from these tests are close to the thresholds that he has estimated using the Hansen approach. With this, I would like to compliment him again for this wonderful paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anshuman. So shall we take a quick 1 or 2 questions if there are any? No? So if there are no questions, since we are running 22 minutes late, Piali,
Yes.
my apologies to you since your session took 40 minutes instead of 25 minutes. Can I please request you to share your slideshow with the author on a bilateral basis?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I'll do
yeah, so
definitely.
then
Thank
that
you.
way that way we'll be able to finish. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for an excellent set of papers, and thank you for all your hard work. And I do apologize for running over on time, but we had technical difficulties. And, since this was the first session, I'm sure we'll be able to overcome those. And for the next few sessions, today and tomorrow, you have a wonderful day. Without, of course, all these technical difficulties. And hopefully the chairs will be better than me and keep on time. So thank you very much. And let's stop here. Thank you.